Welcome, students. This is the first lesson in Unit B. It's called Energy Transfer. So we're going to talk about cooling systems that cool things down. And in particular, we want to explore this notion that heat is transferred from hot objects to cold objects. Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about is this law of thermodynamics, the first law. And it says heat cannot be created nor destroyed, only transferred from one place to another. So you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, I make heat all the time. Every time I strike a match, I make heat. But ask yourself, did you make the match? No, you didn't. Who made the match? Some guy at the match factory. And where did that guy get the materials to make the match? From the earth. So the earth actually supplies all of our materials. The sun actually is where the energy came from on the earth. And so you and I aren't creating heat and we're not destroying heat. But we can transfer it. When we light the match, the heat goes from the match to another place, the surroundings. So that's the first concept. Second concept is the second law of thermodynamics, which is heat flows from hot areas to cold areas. It does not go from cold areas to hot areas. So imagine an ice cube on your hand. So when you put that thing on your hand, your hand gets cold. And so what you think is happening is cold is going into your hand. But that's actually not what's happening. Here's what's happening. It's actually the opposite. What's really happening is heat is leaving your hand and going into the ice cube and doing the work of melting it. The reason your hand feels cold is because the heat is leaving the hand. So heat always flows from hot to cold. Okay, so with that concept in mind, that heat goes from hot to cold, let's look at an engine and a radiator. So first part is this thing called a radiator. And there's a radiator cap. Now, what goes in the radiator? Well, this stuff called antifreeze. So if you look right here, it says this is antifreeze or coolant. So I'm going to talk about the coolant side of things. Let's imagine it's summertime, your engine's hot, and it needs to cool down. So the coolant goes inside the radiator. Ooh, that's an ugly arrow. The coolant goes right there inside the radiator. Open up the radiator cap and pour in the coolant. So coolant comes in different colors. I've seen green, orange. There's reasons for those colors, but I'm not going to get into that with this video. Okay, so we know we pour the coolant inside the radiator, and let's figure out the other parts. We have these things called fins. We have to have a fan and a fan belt. And there's the bottom radiator hose. The engine, of course, the big block in the center, engine block. There's the heater, which is the mechanism that blows heat into the cab. And the top radiator hose. Okay, now, gasoline's in the engine. We burn the gasoline, and that gives off a bunch of heat. The heat is good. That's what the energy from the burning gasoline is what powers the car. The bad thing is it gets so hot it can damage the engine, so we need to cool it down. So how do we do that? Well, let's take a look at this. So we know that we're going to fill the radiator up with coolant. So the coolant is in there. All right. Now, the coolant is cold, and it travels into the engine. Now, I know it looks like there's a wall there, but you'll see another in the next slides why it goes in there. Anyway, so the coolant circulates around like so. Now, I'm just going to erase that, and I'm going to draw just a drop. I am terrible. I'll try that one more time. Okay, let's see if I can draw. Well, it's not getting much better. Okay, anyway, there's a drop of coolant, giant drop of coolant. Now, the metal in the engine is hot, and hot goes from hot to cold. So the hot metal gives its heat to that antifreeze, or that coolant, I should say. Okay, so that coolant absorbs the heat from the metal in the engine. And then what happens next is that drop, I guess, would itself get hot. And it now then travels up here and then into the radiator. Now I'm just going to clear off the screen here. Now as the hot coolant, it's weird to call it hot coolant, but the coolant that has now heated up goes into the radiator. Now, wind is blowing as you're driving down the road, and the wind sort of goes through. And something cool happens there. This coolant that's circulating through here, remember, heat moves from hot to cold. So the coolant itself that's hot gives its heat to these metal fins that are all the way down. And those metal fins get hot, and then they give their heat to the air as it's rushing past. The inside of where the engine compartment is can get hot, and so this fan starts blowing and pushes the air around and out. There's lots of places for it to escape. So a whole bunch of times we go from hot to cold, and that's basically how the coolant works in the engine. Okay, I'll show this one more time now. So coolant comes down here, up into the engine, circulates through, cools down, and then the process starts all over again. Also, we also have a flow up this way into the heater. The heater then blows heat into the cab, which means some of the heat is lost in here. It's cold. It cools down, I should say. And then this also can circulate back through. Here's another look at an engine and a radiator. So let's review one more time. Okay, so coolant, it's hot. It's coming out of the engine. It goes through the radiator. And then it comes down here, goes into the engine again. Now, I don't know if you can see this. Right here, that says water channels in block and head. Okay, so this bad boy right here is called the engine block. Now, if you look right here, these are actually like little slots or slits or channels. And that's actually where the coolant is flowing. It's flowing through. So if you imagine the coolant is flowing through there, the metal is hot. It gives its heat to the coolant, and then the coolant circulates through and then back out. Here on this diagram, here is the heater. And yeah, I think that's good for that diagram. Okay, let's move on. Here's another diagram. So same concept again. We're leaving the engine. We come into the radiator. It's hot. We flow through here. And then back into the engine. We circulate around. And then out. We also have a flow up into the heater core. And so there you go. There's a couple of different ways to look at the engine. So this is actually what the what the radiator looks like, with some of it dismantled. So if I show the coolant flows through there, which is actually this kind of flattened down tube. So there's the coolant flowing through there. So look at how many of those there are. Okay, so the coolant's flowing through there. As the coolant flows through there, we go from hot to cold. This hot coolant gives heat off to these fins. So we go from hot to cold. Okay, so here's the front view of this. And the coolant is flowing through this way. and heat then goes out of that coolant into these fins, and then air blows by the fins, and again we go from hot to cold. Hot here to the cold fins. The fins heat up, and then the cold air blows over the fins, and then the hot fins give their heat to the colder air, and we still go from hot to cold. So if you look at this again, here's the liquid is flowing, the coolant is flowing through there, and then out it goes. Flowing through there, flowing through there, sound effects. And then heat goes, and then heat goes from the coolant into those fins. Okay? All right, so that's what all of that looks like. Different radiators have different styles, I guess. You can see the styles on this one. There's the channels. There's the channels, a little smaller. I don't know which one works better. I would think maybe that one, but I don't know. Okay, moving on. Okay, students, this bad boy right here is my truck. Engine, look at radiator. There's all those little fins. You can see how many there are. There's the little channel we're talking about. So, what would this be? That top radiator hose. Bottom radiator hose down there. There's the engine. Heat in there. Bottom radiator hose must be down here somewhere. Anyway, here we are. Here's a cool thing. Air blows through here, then it goes through those fins. There's also a fan. You can see the fan down there. The fan blows, and basically as the air is flowing through the fins cool down by sucking heat out of the hot liquid in there, transfers the heat into the fin, and then the air takes the hot fin and makes it colder. Okay, so let's take a look at one. We'll look at this one more way, just a little differently. So I drew my cheap diagram of radiator fan, couple of hoses, engine. And we know number one, as the fuel burns, the engine gets hot. Okay, so this is now hot. 2, the radiator is filled with coolant. So I know I've got coolant in here. Number 3, coolant flows from the bottom of the radiator to the engine. Okay, so my coolant flows into the engine. Heat from the engine flows into the coolant. Okay, so the coolant gets hot because heat is going into the coolant. So I'm going to change the coolant to a red color now because it's hot now. Okay, and then coolant flows to the top of the radiator. Okay, so now my coolant's hot, and it goes into the top of the radiator. Okay, and then the coolant flows through the radiator, so it's going through here, and then the fins get hot because the coolant transfers heat to the fins, those little metal fins. So I'm going to now show this is just hot metal now. The fins get hot. Okay. And then the next thing that happened, let's change this to a blue color. Air rushes through here. Air rushes through. And heat transfers from the coolant to the fins to the air. So now the air gets a little bit hot. So as the air is brushing by the fins, which are now hot, the fins give their the heat transfers from the hot fins to the cooler air, and the air heats up. And then the fan blows and then blows the air out of the area, so more colder air can come in. So, heat transfers from the coolant to the fins to the air, and then the coolant is now colder and flows back to the engine again. All right, so there you go. There's lots of different ways to look at this. I'll put a link on Google Drive about radiators, how they're made. You can watch that if you'd like. And there might be a couple other video links there as well. All right, that's it. Thank you.